Introduce our next set of speakers this afternoon. The papers they will present touch on various aspects of consumer learning and behavior change. And the studies you will hear about employ very interesting methodologies, and their results can help us better understand how presenting information in different and novel ways can influence consumer decision-making and behavior. This group of papers is sure to appeal to our interdisciplinary audience today, so let's get started. Up first, we have Dr. Bruce Carlin, who is a finance professor from UCLA. Professor Carlin conducts both theoretical and empirical studies of consumer financial decision-making and retail financial products. Dr. Carlin's paper is entitled Learning Millennial Style, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Carlin.
All right, so thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Chris, for organizing such a great conference. This is very important for our consumer welfare. So learning millennial style, this is a first stab at this type of research. We don't view this as the last word, but as you'll see, it's, this is an issue that's of growing importance. So the idea here is that learning online is booming. People are accessing YouTube in huge numbers. They have about 1 billion unique users every month. And more US adults that are millennials use YouTube than any cable network, and that includes ESPN, so that's really shocking. However, we know very little about how these videos not only affect people's decision-making, but also about their information sharing. And so this becomes very important because if we are going to affect education in our communities, what we'd like to do is have good education, but have it go viral and propagate. And so there's information percolation in our markets. And so this is important for both academics that are interested in it and for policymakers. Now, the venue that we're looking at here is financial literacy training. And so we all know that financial literacy training is in short supply. But there's now growing evidence that people using videos and online mechanisms, this is very helpful. So people respond better to just-in-time educational resources. When there's entertainment and vicarious learning, they learn well. And also that videos seem to do better than just reading a pamphlet or just reading a website. And so, this is a potentially powerful way that we can educate our consumers, especially our young people who are entering into financial markets. So, what do? Well, we study how video content simultaneously affects decision-making, information sharing online, and also how it interacts with other forms of information, especially like deceptive advertising. And so, what do? Well, we actually made our own videos, and instead of cherry-picking videos off of YouTube, we made this commitment to make our own videos so we could create purposeful variation in the videos and then get variation in the dependent variables. And so it's an animated cartoon. It's very snarky, and we pilot tested this. And it basically tells people that they should be aware of credit card traps, the interest rates that they are quoted may not be fixed, and that their credit limits may exist, or they do exist, but they may not be specified. And so we also know that by making it ourselves, we can control and make sure people hadn't seen it before. And to date, about 1,600 different subjects have participated. The main study that I'm going to show you is including about a little over 800 participants. And the participants all watched a version of the video. So the video, there was a base version, and then there was a version in which at the end there's about a 15-second recap of the main lessons and where to find these things in a credit card disclosure. The participants then chose among 4 credit cards, and for half the participants, there were some deceptive taglines that I'll show you in a minute that were associated with the choice. So it was a 2x2 study, very simple design, where you either saw the base video or the base video plus this implementation tag, or you either saw no ads or ads. Okay, and then what we did is we assessed people's sharing, their perceptions, their attention, and overall their search process. So this is what the hypothetical credit card decision looked like. And so you can see, I'm the first one to use the pointer, you can see over here, these are the tags. Okay, so for instance, this card has low APR, but it's deceptive because it's not the lowest APR. Okay, and you see these pricing and term links. People would have to click on those to find out more information, so we could observe how much time they took in their decision, how many clicks they made in making a good decision, and so we could really look at their search process. Okay, and if they clicked on the pricing and terms link, this is what they would find. So they would find something that looked like a credit card disclosure. Now, we modeled this after a Chase website that had, tags like this, and they had pricing and term links, and this is what Chase's disclosure looks like. So this was really a website that was created to look like, a real choice. Okay, so what did we measure? Well, first of all, it turned out that card C was the dominant card. So we could see what fraction of people chose the best. We could also see how much time they spent on it, and not just time, but the total time, but we could look at how they focused their time on the dominant card versus the other cards. We also looked at the number of clicks. We looked at the sort of how the videos were perceived by people, and also their willingness to share the video. Okay, so these are the things we looked at. Okay, so what did we find? Well, the first thing is that the deceptive ads really curtailed the search process. And that's not surprising, but people spent less time on their search. They satisfied more, meaning that there was a big effect where there were 0 clicks. So in control, there would be maybe 10, 12% of the people that never clicked on pricing and terms. If you added this deceptive ad, it went up to about 50 to 60%. And so it really curtailed the process. People who had the deceptive ads, it had an adverse effect on their choice. And we could show that the lower attention that they were putting into this, not only in total time, but their focus on the right card actually led to the worst choices. Now, the tag video with the implementation tag actually led to a higher search process. And so, overall, seeing the tag video led to more time spent. However, it was qualified by an interaction. So if there was no deceptive ads, people seeing the base and the tag video, they basically spent about the same amount of time. However, when there were the ads, they spent a lot more time looking at it when they had seen this implementation video. So the implementation tag was able to overcome some of the search friction that the deceptive ads led to. Now, when we looked at the difference in clicks between the good card and all the other cards, having the tag led to a better search. The tag video was associated with better choice, and the higher attention was what caused the better choice. Now, when we look at how the videos were perceived, the tag video actually was perceived as more effective. It was considered less special. It was more useful. But on a lot of the other dimensions, like how interesting it is, how humorous, creative, a lot of other hedonics, it didn't really make any difference. Now, when we looked at sharing, once we controlled for perceived effectiveness, the tagged video was actually less likely to be shared. Okay, so it led to better decisions, but it led to less sharing. Okay, and so this leads us to some real takeaways. So first of all, online videos do have the potential to improve financial decisions. However, just making a humorous kind of what we call sticky format where people really like it doesn't mean that it's going to lead to a good choice. Okay, and so you need to have implementable information. However, there's a fundamental problem with that because the implementable content has the greatest ability to improve decisions, but it lowers the likelihood that things are shared, and so this is a risk. When you add this kind of information, even to something that's perceived as really funny, people like it, etc., you have a risk of really decreasing how this percolates through the market. And so an effective video does not mean a shareable video. Okay, so some other considerations. We ran some studies where we had them watch the video with these lessons and then have them choose a cell phone plan. Of course, we made the cell phone plan complicated, so it was hard to make a decision. We wanted to see what the breadth of this effect would be. And so it turned out that there wasn't that much effect. But it's probably clouded by the fact that people are really good at making cell phone decisions. They could see all the different pitfalls for the cell phone decisions. And so you know, there's something different going on with financial products, and we're going to run some future tests with, you know, other types of loan products, like, you know, maybe home equity lines of credit or other things that would be more in the loan space. Now, the deceptive ads, it was kind of interesting. I still have a posterior belief that the deceptive ads will affect information percolation and sharing, because you know, the deceptive ads have an effect of decreasing search. And so, in essence, you're losing a lot of the information, and the ad takes away, you know, kind of your impulse to want to share information with other people. So even though we couldn't detect it here, I still think that that's something that we're going to want to keep investigating. Now, one thing that we did find was that for people who caught on, who realized once they looked at, you know, the different pricing and terms and they found the right card, and they saw, hey, wait a second, this is tricky, they actually shared more. So there is some effect. I mean, I think there's some effects washing out. And then, you know, as the CFPB is going to prosecute, or, you know, try to prosecute institutions for being, you know, unfair and deceptive and abusive, you know, I think that one of the effects this could have is not just on the consumers themselves, but also have an externality on others. And I think this is something that would be good to look at. Finally, you know, one of the things we're planning on doing is a field study. We're going to try to partner up with somebody and not just do this in an experimental setting. And finally, we want to look at sort of how robust these, you know, these education materials are. Meaning that if we show people it today, how does this affect what's the decay? What's their, you know, how does this affect choice over time? And so there's a lot more to do in this space for both financial decisions and for other types of education. And so we don't view this as the last word. This is the first study of its kind, but we want to keep studying this in different venues and try to keep learning about the market. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carlin. Up next, we have a paper called Simulated Experience and Investment Endurance that will be presented by Dr. Stefan Zeisberger. Dr. Zeisberger is a professor and director of the Center for Behavioral Finance at Stony Brook University in New York. And please welcome to the podium Dr. Stefan Zeisberger.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very nice introduction, and thanks to the organizers for having me here. It's a great pleasure, and I think it's really important to be here. So yesterday night I was teaching for the very last time in this term, which made me very happy. So I was smiling on the way I flew over here. I took the airplane directly after the last lecture. And in the last lecture, I asked my students what they have learned in my class. So I hand them a piece of paper, empty one, and they should just write me their comments, what they think they have learned in class. Happily, all the papers I received had some written notes on them. So at least they thought they have learned something. And one of them I have with me, which made me laugh a bit. So that student wrote me, "Dear Professor, of particular interest was to me the information You taught us about how to properly invest in the stock market. Without that knowledge, I would have undoubtedly made some awful mistakes in the future. So thank you very much, Professor, in advance for potentially saving me thousands of dollars. You're welcome, dear student. So what I taught them basically in one of the sessions was how to invest if you're a non-expert, which is basically, I think, the main agenda here. And I taught them, okay, you shouldn't pick stocks or try to time the market, just invest in a well-diversified, broad, low-cost index fund. They will constantly ask me whether this is whether they should buy like this or that stock, but I keep on telling them, okay, just do the indexing and that's good. Even with that knowledge that you should invest in an index, there's still one very important question that is remaining, that is, how much risk am I actually willing to take, or am I supposed to take? How much risk should I take? And this is my talk, if these slides show up. Do I have to click on this? Oh, here we go. Thanks. Good. So the talk is about how much risk should I actually take, which is a fairly important question, which we all talk in Finance 101, we finance professors talk about the capital market line and say, okay, aggressive investors should invest more, conservative investors should invest less, but we hardly know how to measure risk preference appropriately and how to communicate risk in a way that the investor is able to tell us how much risk he or she is willing to take. So why is this important? This is fairly important because more and more investors have to do their investment decisions on their own. And at the same time, there's a strong evidence in the literature that at least large parts of the population are suffering from very low risk and financial literacy. At least in Europe, there's also pressure from the regulator. The European regulator tells financial institutions, before you can offer any product to any of your clients, you have to assess his or her risk preferences. But at the same time, the regulator doesn't tell us how to do so, which is good for us researchers because then we have a lot of things to do. So what is the right way to communicate risk to investors that are maybe suffering from low financial literacy? There's various ways in which we can change the presentation format of an investment task. And the one I want to focus here is what recently was explored in more and more detail and became a really hot topic in psychology and in finance also now, is the so-called experience description gap. That is, whether I present something by description or by experience. Let me show an example to make this clear. So this is description. Suppose you have two different options, the left and right. The right option gives you 3 monetary units, let's say $3,000 for sure, with 100% certainty. Probability, and the left option is a risky option, which gives you with 80% 4 monetary units, let's say $4,000, and with the remaining probably nothing. So depending on your risk preferences, the left one has a slightly higher expected value, but really depending on your risk preferences, you choose the risky option or the safe option. There's no right or wrong here. This is by description. I just described you the problem. Experience means that you do not know these numbers, but you have to experience them by random sampling. How does this look like? You basically, again, assume we do not know the numbers, but these are the underlying probabilities behind these two options. So you start to sample now the left option and sample over and over again. And so you get a feeling of what it looks like, what is the underlying probability distribution. Then you switch to the right option, and here it gets kind of boring because we already know that it's 3 for sure, but the investors or the experimental participants do not know that. So the question is now, having these two possibilities of presenting the very same problem, it's not the very same, but let's not talk about the difference between risk and uncertainty here because it's not relevant for our study. The question now is whether the behavior is different between the two ways we can present the same investment problem. And there was a study conducted, this was the first one by colleagues in Basel or Berlin, Ralf Hertwig, who conducted a clean, controlled experiment, incentivized. And what do you think is there a difference between the two presentation forms, and in which presentation form are the experimental participants more willing to take risks? some of you might know, others might not. So in the description case, about a third of the participants took the risky option. There was another group that didn't see these description numbers, but they saw they could experience the two options. And here, the fraction of participants taking the risky option was about 90%. A huge difference. This is not, I mean, we don't have to talk about statistical significance here. This is economically significant. There's a couple of shortcomings with this study, but these shortcomings have been discussed in the literature in detail. The first two studies that transferred these insights, that there's a fundamental difference between describing a problem and experiencing it, are the two lower papers I cited here. So colleagues from Mannheim, Martin Weber and Christine Kaufmann, Emily Hazley, they published recently in Management Science a paper that showed that this holds true in a financial context, that if we present something by experience, people are more willing to take risks. And in a recent paper we published in Review of Finance, we showed that this even holds true for various robustness checks, and if we control for this and that, and also if we take different relatively difficult products. So for structured products we talked about this morning, this even holds true here. Okay, now let's come to our study. So we took this a step further and we ran a large-scale, long-term online experiment in which we had 3 different treatments, and these treatments are the blue one, the red one, and the green one. So we had one treatment called description, where we just described the investment task, and the 2 other treatments were some form of simulation, so some form of experience sampling or simulated experience. After that, the main task of our subjects was to do an asset allocation between stocks and bonds. And we measure how these different forms of presenting the very same problem influence their behavior. Not only that, we also ask them for some probability estimates and how well they informed they feel about the decision and how confident they feel of having made the right decision. And then over a course of 3 weeks, they actually gained actual experience, and we can then look at whether this actual experience, to what extent this will affect their behavior over the long run. Because we do not want to only measure the immediate effect here. All right, let me show you the 3 treatments to make this clear how this looked like. The description treatment, it's a direct screenshot, is describing the problem, and we made everything possible, and we took all the insights from the behavioral literature to make this as clear as possible. So we used easy wording, we provided them with examples, and we even showed them the return distribution in a graphical manner, not only verbally. This is the description treatment. The second treatment is what we call the final return simulation. Here you can imagine it's like an animated tool where these bars represent single possible stocks that can occur. So they fly from left to right, and so you experience one possible return after each other. That is the sampling here. And finally, this distribution builds up. So each time this bar flies to the right and falls on this axis here, it builds up the distribution until the final distribution is shown here. This takes about like 10 or 30 seconds. And the distribution to the right is the very same that we described. So it's a pure framing effect here. And this is the third treatment, which we call the wealth path simulation, where we basically not only show the final or simulate the final return distribution, but we also show the price path with which these single returns are achieved, to make the investors aware of the fact that there might be some ups and downs in between. So there's 2 things that can go on here. First, maybe it makes more salient that possible losses will be canceled out by some other gains. So maybe this nudges investors to invest more because they kind of understand that there's ups and downs, but finally they will end up with that return distribution. On the other hand, there's quite some evidence in the literature on myopic loss aversion. David did some work on that, others too, which might lead to the opposite effect, that if you see that it can really crash in between, even though it recovers finally, you might be scared of investing because you fear that intermediate loss or immediate loss is not that beneficial for you. Okay. Without going into the details of the experimental design, we basically made sure that everything is sound and waterproof. This is the result for the initial investment decision. Color coding is the same, description always in blue, and the other ones, the final return simulation is in red, the wealth path simulation is in green. The result here is that subjects invest significantly more in the risky asset. So any form of simulation, the two forms that we tested here, will again show the same effect. Investors are willing to invest more if the investment task is presented in some form of simulation, which is good, because we normally assume that people save not enough for retirement. So typically we would assume that this is a better decision. However, we want to find some more evidence that this is really a better decision. How can we do so? We basically ask them how well informed they feel about the investment task and how confident they are in having made the right decision. This is the result here, and we see that we find a significant increase in feeling informed. We do not find any significant differences in feeling confident, which is consistent with the previous literature. But interestingly enough, the wealth path simulation leads to the highest feeling informed of our experimental subjects here. This is still kind of subjective, so can we come up with some objective measure of whether this is really a better decision to invest more? They might feel better informed, but maybe they still end up with more risk than they actually wanted to. So we asked them about the probability distribution to give us some estimates. For example, what is the likelihood of a certain event like a loss or a gain higher than 100%? And to cut a long story short, the gray bars show you the true probabilities that we can just basically read out of the distribution, and the three colors represent again the three different treatments. The main result here is that for the probability of losing, which is displayed to the very left, we have a heavy overestimation for these likelihoods. However, we find some positive effects regarding the simulation again. So in this simulation, the average estimates are better for any of these events. In the middle, it's not really clear, but if we then talk about this probability of gain higher than 100%, yes, again, if we use a simulation, estimates are closer to the true values. These are just averages, so maybe they spread around like crazy. Let's compare the standard deviation of answers, and here we can see an even stronger effect. So no matter what form of simulation we use, and the wealth path simulation turns out to be the best here, estimates are just better. And if we take absolute deviations, we get again the same result. So no matter what exact definition of misestimates or misestimation we use, the wealth path simulation seems to perform best, which is interesting because it not only shows the final returns, it also shows the wealth path. So it provides more information, and the wealth path is kind of irrelevant to estimate the final return, but still they do better on these estimates. All right, so this is, now let's turn to the second part of the experiment, where we regarded or analyzed their investment behavior over time. So at the beginning, so this is now the 14 periods we used in this experiment. So at the beginning, you see this significant gap between the simulation and the descriptions. The simulations lead to higher risk-taking, and I would like to divide this into two parts here. So in the second half of the investment horizon, in any group, investments go down, investments in the stocks go down and the risky assets. So showing that in any case, investors seem to lock in some gains, which is kind of consistent with empirical results. If we look at the first half, we can see that only in the case where we described and not experienced the investment problem, investments go up. So that means, in other words, that if we describe a problem rather than letting investors experiencing it, they need some time to learn. They need some actual experience to learn how much risk they're actually willing to take. The other two lines are relatively stable. I don't want to oversell these results. To be honest, you can look at them, but at least the only significant increase we find is in the blue line. All right, let me wrap up with the conclusion and to finish on time. So with simulated experience, investors make riskier decisions. They feel better informed about their decision and better understand the underlying return distribution measured in how good the return estimates are. And they do not feel greater regret with the riskier decisions. It could be that they invest more in the risky asset, they feel greater regret afterwards because they have seen, oh, I've taken too much risk, but this is not the case. So we ask them about their satisfaction with the final results and do not find any significant differences here, or even a reduction. So actual experience is also a substitute for simulated experience, so the effect is not persistent over time, so we do not find consistently higher investments in one of the simulations. If we differentiate between the two ways I presented, the final return distribution leads to the highest increase of risk-taking. However, the wealth path simulation leaves investors with feeling even better informed, and it also leads to even better return estimates. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Cami Cunin, an associate professor of finance at the Keenan-Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina and the president of the Society for Neuroeconomics. Dr. Cunin conducts experimental and field research focused on understanding how people make economic decisions in markets and firms. Today, Professor Cunin will present a paper entitled Stock Ownership and Learning from Financial Information. Welcome, Dr. Cunin.
Thank you so much. All right, so it's great to be part of this conference, and it's so wonderful to see policy people and academics all being so keen on understanding household finance issues. This was not the situation, a decade ago even. So today we'll try to show you that if you're trying to understand how households learn about outcomes in financial markets, it may be important to look at what is in these households' portfolios, because there seems to be a connection between what households own, whether or not they are in the stock market, and how they process new information about how the stock market is doing. So this paper is done with two co-authors who are both neuroscientists from Germany, and the reason why this is done with neuroscience is because you'll see that part of this experiment is trying to connect stock ownership with learning ability. We actually got brain imaging data from the participants. So this is a study that involves having people be in a brain scanner basically while they're investing. So this is probably a new approach for the day for household finance research. All right. So let me tell you why we decided to run this experiment. It really started from a puzzling fact that some people in this audience actually wrote about, including John Campbell, that the majority of households in the US and in Europe do not invest $1 in the stock market. They stay out of the stock market. This is called a non-participation puzzle, and of course there are many reasons why this may be happening. We're not quite sure whether all of these reasons actually are happening in the data, but for example, you can imagine that there's an insufficient provision of financial services to some households. Now, it cannot be that half of the American households can't find an intermediary through which they can put $1 in the stock market, so something else is also at play here probably. And so another possibility is that a lot of these households do not invest because they lack of the understanding of how to make a financial decision and how to interpret information about financial investments. So to be more concrete about this second hypothesis in this experiment, we basically suggested that, or we tested the idea that it is possible that some households are staying out of the stock market because they have incorrect beliefs about what they can attain by making investment decisions, by putting money in equities. And so to be more specific, we believe that if you are somebody who's outside of the stock market, who in your portfolio you have no stocks whatsoever, you will actually not pay attention to good news about the market. You'll only pay attention to bad news about the market, and that's going to actually keep you out of the stock market. So this is the mechanism that we're trying to test, that basically a lot of people are staying out of the equities market because they have overly pessimistic beliefs about what they can achieve by investing, and this is happening because learning is asymmetric. People learn more if they're out of the stock market from bad outcomes about stocks, whereas if you're in the stock market already, you tend to learn more from good outcomes about stocks. This is the story we're trying to see, to test in these data. Okay, so again, just to simplify the research question, we're trying to see whether or not prior investment choices, what you have in your portfolio at this moment, influence your ability to learn from new financial information. And if this is true, if there's an effect of portfolio choice on how people learn, which information they tend to pay more attention to, what is the mechanism that drives this behavioral effect? And for that, we decided to look inside the brain and see whether or not, if we do observe a mistake, a bias in learning, if it's actually driven by a specific brain mechanism. So let me tell you about the experiment. Because it is a brain imaging experiment, which is very expensive to run, you have to limit your sample to not very many people, because each person that you run costs about $1,000 basically. But what you do in these imaging experiments, from one person you get a lot of data. So from each person in the sample, we got 96 data points. So a lot of the identification that I'll talk about is going to be done within person. So the sample is 46 male participants. They're all from Bonn, from Germany. They are actually regular people. They're not college students. They have jobs. And they make decisions about their finances. We wanted to look at sort of real people. And they span the age 29 to 49 years of age. All right. So like I said, people have to make 96 investment decisions. So these are our data points per person. And I wanted just to take a minute to explain the setup so everybody gets it. So these 96 decisions are split in blocks of 6. So there are 16 blocks. And basically the world is restarted. In these people's heads, we restart their problem, their learning problem, what they got to do after each block of 6 trials. So let's think about one block of 6 trials. So just to be more specific, I'll show you an example. Just throw a picture. So I don't know if you can see this from at the top, but just focus on the very top panel. This is one trial. These things in the top panel represent one trial in a block of 6. And this trial happens to be in a block that's in what we call the gain condition. That is, the payoffs of the investments available to the person to choose from are all going to be positive. In other blocks, the payoffs are all going to be negative, because in some other work I've shown that learning is different depending on whether or not people see a lot of negative signs or a lot of positive signs. In the loss domain, beliefs tend to be overly pessimistic, so that's why in the design we have gain learning blocks and loss learning blocks. But let's just focus for now on the gain block. So there you see that the subject observes, in this trial, just like in any trial, I have to choose between holding the stock or the bond. If I were to choose the bond this trial, I will make for sure 6 euros. If I were to choose the stock, I would make either 10 or 2, and I'm not sure what will be the stock dividend. Now, no matter what I choose, stock or bond, I always learn how much that stock paid, right? So here, in this particular trial, I learned that the stock paid 10 euros. And this is, at the end of this trial, and remember there are 6 such trials, so 6 observations about what the stock is doing in a block. At the end of this trial, I asked the question, what is the probability that the stock is the good one? So let me take a second to explain this. People are told, look, in the beginning of the block, this stock that you'll face will be good or bad, and you don't know exactly how it's going to be. It's 50-50 that's going to be the good one or the bad one. Now, what is the good one? The good stock is the one that gives these people the high dividend, the 10 euro dividend, with a high probability of 70% on each trial. The bad stock is the one that gives them the low dividend, the 2 euro dividend, with 70% probability. So initially, you have no idea if you're going to be faced with basically a good distribution of outcomes or a bad distribution of outcomes. And your job will be, every single trial, you have to update your belief with respect to whether or not the stock is the good or the bad one. You start with a 50-50 prior, because you really don't know. And then, for example, if this was the very first trial in the block, you learned that the stock gave you a $10 or 10 euro dividend, right? You have to push your belief from what it was before, which was 50%. You got to push it up because you just saw a high dividend. So now the chance of this being the good stock is higher because you just saw a high dividend. So if you see a bunch of high dividends, your belief about this being the good stock, that probability has to go up. If you see a bunch of low dividends, that probability has to go down. So this is how we're going to quantify how well people learn about these assets. We're going to see whether or not their beliefs, these probabilities, these posterior beliefs about the chance of this being the good stock, whether this belief that everybody has to express in a trial is close to the truth, to the objection, to the objective Bayesian value, or it's really far. So people are clueless about learning from these dividends. Okay? So like I said, there are going to be 16 blocks of 6 trials apiece. And so what's important to note here in this task is that because nobody will force you to keep the same choice trial after trial, you can always switch. Sometimes you can hold a bond, sometimes you can hold a stock. It is optimal for you to learn from the stock outcomes, whether they're high or low. If you see a 10 or a 2, you should always learn equally well from the two of them, no matter what you currently have in your portfolio, what you chose this trial. Because in the next trial, you can change your decision. There's no cost to that. So let's see how people do. It turns out that the information that investors will learn more. That is, if you look at what they tell you as their posterior belief, this is the good stock, that belief is impacted more by information about that stock that matches the person's previous choice. So if I'm the stockholder this trial, if I chose this trial to own the stock, I will update more if I see a high dividend paid by the stock. Whereas if I'm the bondholder, so this trial I chose to stay out of the stock, I will update my beliefs more after seeing a low dividend of the stock. So basically, people update more from information which matches what they just did, what they just put in their portfolio. So let's see the data. I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs to simplify things. So, and also remember, this is identification done within person, because each person sometimes goes for a stock, sometimes goes for the bond. So it's not across people, it's even within person you can observe this result. So take, for example, situations where the prior belief that this is the good stock that people expressed was a pretty high number. They said, yeah, there's a pretty good chance this is the good stock. So let's control for the prior belief, say it's higher than 50%, and let's see what the posterior belief is. So what they say at the end of this trial. Does that depend on whether or not this person in this trial was a stockholder or a bondholder? And the answer is going to be yes. There's about a 10% almost difference in the posterior beliefs expressed by people who chose the stock versus those who chose the bond, controlling for their prior, controlling for the beliefs they had before they made the choice. So the ownership itself seems to change the beliefs expressed by the people at the end of the trial. And the same actually happens if you look at situations where before they made their choice, people had pretty sort of pessimistic assessments of the quality of the stock. Their prior was below 50%. Again, you see that if they, for whatever reason, they chose to go for the stock rather than the bond, after the trial, they basically believe in the stock more. They're more optimistic about it if they chose the stock rather than if they chose the bond. Now let me show you a plot indicating how these people update. And you can see that the results are significantly, they're bigger if you look at updating after high dividends. Again, here what I'm doing is I'm controlling for people's prior belief, what they expressed right before they made a choice. When I ask them, what is the chance that this is the good stock, the one that's paying from the better distribution, I take their answer, this is their prior belief, and I'm holding that constant. And then, like I said, some people, for some reason, go for the stock in the next trial. For some other reason, they may go for the bond in the next trial, but I hold their belief before the choice, hold that constant. And then I see how they update after they see a high dividend. In this trial, the stock pays a high dividend. And I want to know if the updating, that is, if you look at the change in from the prior belief that they expressed to what they tell to me right now in this trial, in terms of what they think is the probability this is the good stock, I'm going to look at whether or not this update in their belief depends on whether they're the stockholder or the bondholder in this trial, if they went for the stock or for the bond. And of course, you can see here that the answer is yes. So controlling for people's belief prior to choice, stockholders have a more positive update. This red line is clearly above the blue line. They update more from seeing a high dividend than bondholders do, controlling for their thoughts before they chose stock versus bond. And you see the pattern for observing low dividends is no, it's not at all like this, like what you see after seeing high dividends. It actually goes in the opposite direction. That is, there you see that the bondholders push their beliefs down more. They update more after seeing a low dividend relative to stockholders. So this can also be done, of course, in a regression framework. You can throw in there subject fixed effects, so estimate everything within subject. And you see that if you are a stockholder in this trial and you saw a high dividend relative to being a bondholder who saw the high dividend, your belief is 5% more, goes up by 5% more. That is, stockholders react more to a high dividend than bondholders by about 5%, which is a pretty significant number. Now, this is behavioral data, but I wanted to take you now to the brain level results. So again, what we see is that people seem to update more from stock information which matches their previous choice, and this makes no sense. In this task, people should learn equally well from all of the outcomes because they can always change their portfolio. So I want to know why this is going on. Actually, are they just lying to me? Maybe they can do this very well in their heads. Maybe their brain tracks perfectly well all the relevant information, but they're just lying, and they're lying in a very consistent manner. So these people, remember, they were in fMRI, in functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. So these are brain scanners, and they were doing this experiment in the brain scanner. So we can track activation all over the brain, and especially we can look at activation in the brain's valuation centers, which have been pretty well documented by people who've been working in neuroeconomics. I'm glad to see David here today to represent the area. So we sort of know, if we try to understand, is the brain keeping track of the value of available options? We know where to look in the brain. We know where those calculations are done. And so I'd like to understand whether or not, if you are a stockholder this trial versus being a bondholder this trial, if your brain valuation system engages differently when you see a high dividend versus a low dividend. Do you see this bias in learning at the brain level, depending on what was your previous choice, what's in your portfolio right now? And the answer is yes. And this is just easier to show in a picture. So whenever you see these pictures from fMRI experiments, you'll see a gray slice of a brain and then some yellow dots on that picture. Basically, these areas that are colored here, they are areas where if you're doing a particular comparison, let's say compare average activation in the center in treatment versus control or some other two separate groups of data points, if that difference is significant, then the intensity of the color is pretty high. So an intense yellow or an intense red represents a more significant difference in terms of the activation in this particular area if you were to compare two conditions or two subgroups of the data. So what this means that we observe here, looking at the brain valuation centers, which span the ventral striatum, which is a very primitive center, sort of at the core of the brain that encodes reward information. It also spans the prefrontal cortex up here right behind your brain where the final calculation seems to be made, and the posterior cingulate cortex, which is a lot of the mathematical calculations are also done. If you look at these centers, you'll see that there is some significant difference in activation in these centers between certain conditions, and let me tell you what these conditions are. So if you look at these graphs, they show you that if you're looking at how this activation in these centers change when people see a high dividend or a low dividend, depends on whether or not in that trial the person was a stockholder or a bondholder. And in particular, you see that the valuation centers, the ventral striatum, the prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, all of them show a similar pattern. That is, after seeing a high dividend, it's the stockholders, the red lines, that respond more, whereas after seeing a low dividend, it's the blue lines, it's the bondholders that respond more. Okay, so again, what the brain is doing is these valuation centers are responding more to information which matches the person's choice in that particular trial. So this is all I'm sorry, one more thing to say is that you can in fact predict on a trial-by-trial basis whether or not their probability estimate is going to be close to the truth, to the objective value, the Bayesian number, or if it's going to be far away, if people are going to make mistakes. You can predict that based on whether or not in that trial that person's valuation centers were engaged, even when information was shown to them that contradicted their previous choice. So for example, these are trials where we're looking at people who chose the bond that trial, but they see a high dividend, so this is contradictory information to what they chose. If these people somehow do manage to engage their valuation centers, the prefrontal cortex and the striatum, their estimation error, that trial is lower. So they do a better job. So what are the implications of these findings? I'm not saying that this particular pattern explains everything with respect to why we're missing a bunch of households from the stock market, but it's a possible channel that could tell us why these people are missing from investing in equities, right? The idea is that if you're not in equities, you're not maybe paying attention to good outcomes in stock markets, and you might end up with a pessimistic assessment of what you can get by investing in stocks, and that's why you're going to stay on the sideline. And also, you can think about these findings explaining a bit maybe why you see the disposition effect, which is that people who own stocks that have been losing a lot do not sell these loser stocks. And it could be that, again, if you're the stockholder, you don't really pay attention to the low outcomes of the stock. So you don't update your beliefs correctly. You're overly optimistic about these objectively loser stocks. So I'm gonna stop here just by, again, reminding that the main idea that we're trying to bring here is that when people learn about what's available to them out there in the investment world, their learning might be biased by what they did before, by their previous investment choice, and this could have meaningful implications for certain household finance puzzles like the non-participation puzzle or disposition effect. So thank you so much.
Okay, our final presenter is Dr. Alex Brown, a professor of economics at Texas A&M University. His research focuses broadly on topics in behavioral economics and experimental economics, including financial decision-making. Professor Brown will present our last paper entitled Small Victories, Creating Intrinsic Motivation in Task Completion and Debt Repayment. Please welcome Dr. Brown.
All right. Thank you all for being here. It's been a long day, but hopefully this will go pretty well. All right, so let me just dive in here since I don't have a lot of time. The issue I'm going to be talking about today is probably one that's very easy to convince you is important. The issue is going to be debt. And for millions of Americans, they are dealing with debt in very large amounts, and it's something that's an impediment to their actual ability to retire and develop retirement savings. Now, something that might surprise you is that even though economists talk about debt and government officials talk about debt, many of these people turn to help to different sources, and they look to what are called consumer finance gurus, people who talk on the TV, people who talk on the radio, and people who write books. Now, many of the times, these consumer finance gurus, and you can see some examples right here, they advocate standard economic strategies, like if you're going to pay off your debt, pay it from highest interest rate to lowest interest rate. But sometimes they advocate different strategies. One of those strategies, is the debt snowball. And that says ignore interest rates entirely and just pay off your smallest debt first and then move on to the next smallest and so forth. Now, this sounds a bit absurd to an economics audience, but something you might want to look at is the justification of this argument. So let's take a chance to look at the quote of this. And here we have it right up here. I'll give you a brief second. So the way I interpret this is basically that when you complete these very small debts, that gives you some form of motivation, which will allow you to persist further as you complete your next task. That you get a small win, and that's going to lead you to be more productive or allow you to have greater self-control to continue. And so I interpret that very kind of quickly using the term sub-goal, which I'll use throughout the talk, the idea of you have a large goal, but then you have a smaller goal you want to complete. And somehow completing the smaller sub-goal gives you greater motivation to complete the larger goal entirely. And just to define that in my terms, I use the term post-sub-goal motivation. So meaning after you complete a sub-goal, you achieve this motivation. And there's related psychological work on this. I say inspired by here. I don't necessarily want to get the connections of how close it is to this work. That's something people can argue. But let's just say there's previous work on this type of topic, and it's involved with this concept of self-efficacy and social cognitive theory. Now, there are criticisms to this approach, and not just for the obvious interest rate problem that might happen, that people would spend more on interest, but from a motivational problem. And I'll give you another quote to look up right now. So this quote is saying something a little different. It's saying that the trouble with having these sub-goals is actually people become motivated to complete sub-goals. They complete those sub-goals and then have what is called a complacency effect, where they feel good about completing the sub-goals and then they lose focus for completing the main goals. Now, the thing I want to point out in this presentation is that this argument treats sub-goal motivation a little differently. It's not that you gain motivation from completing a sub-goal, it's that you gain motivation as you come closer to completing the sub-goal. So it's the drive to complete the sub-goal happens as you move closer towards that sub-goal. So I said that's the motivation, the drive, and I refer to this as pre-sub-goal motivation. And there's a lot of literature in psychology on something called the goal gradient hypothesis, which talks a lot about how distance to a goal increases one's persistence towards that goal. And so, as you can kind of guess by these quotes here, I'm going to be approaching this issue a little differently, and maybe a little differently than some people would think about it here. I'm going to talk about not necessarily if the debt snowball is effective, but why it might be effective, and look at the existing motivational theory, as well as creating my own. So this paper, the first thing that I'm going to do is differentiate these two types of motivational theories, this pre and post sub-goal motivation. I'm going to formalize them into a model, and I'm going to develop hypotheses to test. Now from that, I'm going to take it to the laboratory setting. And now it's important to make this distinction again. My lab experiment is not going to necessarily mimic any kind of debt repayment environment, but be a perfect lab setting to test these theories of motivation. And from that test and the models, we can conclude something about this method in general. So we want to keep out any kind of debt context. This is also useful because subjects, if they have thoughts about debt as they enter the lab, aren't going to be acting on those preconceived notions. They're just going to be acting in a predetermined motivational task. And what we're going to find is that having these small wins does improve for performance, as this debt snowball might be tapping into this effect, and we'll explain more what this means for the debt snowball. So one last thing I want to point out, there is previous research on this topic. There's a nice empirical paper that gets a lot at the if this method works. It's by Gall and McShane, and they show in their data in a purely empirical paper that this debt snowball seems to lead to better debt repayment than people who follow the traditional economic form of paying off debt. The other thing I should mention is there are two experimental studies. There's mixed evidence. One is kind of in favor of the debt snowball. One is not in favor of the debt snowball. Both of those do involve having the debt context in the experiment. So let me talk about what is going to happen to the subjects in my experiment. They're going to be doing a very menial task. As I said, it does not have much to do with debt. Instead, they're going to be copying 10-character lines of codes 150 times in a 30-minute period. If they copy all the lines of code, they get a $10 payment plus a bonus for any second they finish early. If they don't complete in time, they have a penalty of 5 seconds per line. I like to think of this task as being like debt repayment because it happens to have a few key features. My favorite one is the third one, that there's uncertainty about ultimate success. I think for Americans that are really suffering with debt, one of the problems they encounter is they wonder if they're going to be in debt for their entire life, and I'm sure that's something that reduces motivation. And so I hope we can capture that a little in this environment. So the way we're going to arrange these 150 lines of code to copy is in columns. And they're going to be 5 columns each. The first one's going to be kind of our debt snowball or small victories method. They're arranged in ascending order. The second one is going to be the reverse of the ascending. We figure if there's an effect from having this ascending order, probably if you take the difference from the ascending to the descending, you'd see the biggest evidence of this effect. And the third case is going to be the even order, where all columns have the same length. This can be thought of as a control, but as it'll turn out once we develop our model, this is also a neat special case. Now, when subjects complete this, they get a congratulations after every column to make completing a column a distinct event. There's also going to be a 10-line practice before this begins, and this will allow us to standardize subject ability when we do our data analysis, as well as familiarize subjects with what they're going to be doing. So let me show you a few screenshots of what this experiment looks like. Also, there were A&M undergraduates earning about $11.25 on average for a 35-minute session. So this is what they see. You see up here, and I can break out the laser pointer for a second. Basically, you start at this point, you try to copy those 10 lines, and you hit this button. If you type them incorrectly, you move down to the next row, which will be revealed to you. If you type it in incorrectly, nothing happens, and you have to keep trying to type it correctly until you get through the task. It is not a particularly fun task. It requires a lot of self-control, and I think that latter part is also similar of paying off of debt. This is what the ascending order looks like. This is what the descending order looks like. And here is our even order. So this is the task people are going to do. Now, I've talked about something, and I've said it's very different from debt repayment. Now I'm going to talk about the model that hopefully connects this to debt repayment. And what I have is a formalized model of task completion, which is going to tie in many of those motivational effects I talked about before. So here's a little table you can follow along with, both in the debt repayment setting and in the experiment. But basically, we want to think about an ultimate goal. we refer to this as large capital X. And this ultimate goal is going to be made up of 100, or not necessarily 150, discrete elements, small x. So in the debt repayment example, big X is paying off all debt, and small x is an individual payment. In our experiment, big X is completing the worksheet, small x is completing one cell. Now this debt is going to be divided into partitions, and they contain distinct x's. So in our experiment, these are the columns, while in debt repayment, these are going to be an individual debt. Now, we're going to have a function for how fast someone can complete a given cell or a given discrete element x, and that's going to be proportional to a function v, which is dependent on the number of subgoals completed. V can be thought of as our post-subgoal motivation function. It's going to be decreasing because you move faster after you complete more subgoals. And then we have h, which is a function dependent on the elements left in your current subgoal. That's going to be increasing because the further away you are from the end, the slower you should move. That's how those are the two main functions that define our completion function. We're also going to include in this function some elements I haven't written on the screen yet. That's going to be controls for individual ability, specific elemental idiosyncrasies. Think of this as if maybe one cell is just very difficult to type for an experimental subject, or maybe December's debt payment's a little harder because it's around Christmas time. And also we're going to have fixed effects to capture any ordering of elements. So if people are better just naturally at the 70th payment as opposed to the 50th payment, that can be captured in the model as well. And that's independent of any kind of ordering of the subgoals. And so I have a lot of mathematical theory that's in a technical appendix that's, well, about 8 pages long. But to boil that all down to one slide, I just want to say that if you look at this model and you think about what is the structure that is ideal to get the fastest performance or get the lowest cost performance in task completion, it turns out that under these pretty general assumptions, ascending order is the best way to go if you believe in post-subgoal motivation. So provided that post-subgoal motivation, that is after completing a subgoal, you move faster, that is going to be the best ordering ascending. Alternatively, if we believe in pre-subgoal motivation, that distance to the end is what motivates you, not completion of a subgoal, then an even ordering is the best. And as it turns out, the worst ordering would be descending. So in either case, if pre or post-subgoal motivation exists, descending will be the worst. Now, if neither of these motivations exist, we shouldn't see anything in our experiment. Everyone should be completing at about the same time. So let's just take a look at our results here. And what do we find? Well, we find out that subjects in this ascending order are about a second per cell faster than subjects in the descending, or subjects in the even, who are a little faster than subjects in the descending. When you look at total performance of who completes the task, ascending subjects completed the task about 70% of the time. It's only 58% for even, and 41% for descending. So you find the ordering we might suspect in the theory, provided post-subgoal motivation is the most powerful. So it's consistent with this idea of the debt snowball that you can achieve more motivation by having tasks arranged in kind of ascending order. The other thing we want to talk about is what we see in the experiment, and you can see these columns up here indicate divisions of our subgoals, and we see generally a downward trend, downward within the column, and also downward after each column. And we can see this in descending as well. I'm sorry, the title's cut off, and also in even. Now, you might look at these charts and not want to believe me and say, well, there could be a lot of things happening there. I agree it's a descent. It's some kind of general improvement. And that's why we can take our model and calibrate it and actually estimate the V and H functions. And that's what I'll do on the next slide. And if you recall, this accounts for individual ability, and it also accounts for any kind of cell-specific effects. And when we graph these functions, they look very similar to what we said was in the theory. We see this V function decreasing, meaning people move faster after completing these columns. And we see this H function that's increasing, which means that the further away you are from a subgoal, the slower you move. So our calibration of the model fits our general assumptions, and this is done for a linear, a quadratic, a cubic, and a quartic type of specification. It doesn't change. And we also see that post-subgoal motivational function is a little greater in magnitude, suggesting that that's, as we expected, that one dominates pre-subgoal motivation. So I'm going to skip ahead here because, I'll skip ahead here and just kind of restate my findings and conclusion because I have some neat extensions that I think are good for the CFPB audience. But the main thing we see is that the ascending order tends to get the best performance. So if we believe, it would be suggestive of the idea that post-sub-goal motivation exists and is more powerful than pre-sub-goal motivation. So there is a general idea that if you want to actually increase motivation in debt repayment, you could use this debt snowball technique within some limits. And I'll move down here. The one warning I want to say, and I'm sure many of you economists in the audience know, despite how powerful whatever I've shown in my slides are, there's always going to be some interest rate that will overpower the debt snowball. And so here, I'm going to do kind of a thought experiment, just take some numbers. If you don't agree with the numbers, it doesn't matter. The general conclusion will hold regardless of what numbers you pick. But in my case, subjects in the ascending order were about 13% more productive than those in the descending order. So let's say magically that people who follow the debt snowball can actually get 13% more money for their payments each month in some kind of loan repayment situation. And so we're going to say that, and they have two $10,000 loans. One is at 10%, and one's variable between 10 and 20%. Given that you could have a greater monthly payment, paying off the lower interest rate first, when is this method effective? And you can see right now on the graph that as long as the second loan was under 17%, you would pay off your loan faster. So again, you can pick on the numbers here, but the general idea is there's always going to be an interest rate that will render any motivational improvement of this task, improvement of the debt snowball will overpower it. So you always have to be careful looking at differential interest rates. To some people, it's good to see this. For other people, it might be obvious. But I always think it's a good caveat to show whenever I say that a particular technique that's against kind of economic intuition is useful. And finally, I'll put up my extensions here. I think there could be some neat things that could be done here. I didn't talk so much about it, but lab experiments might be useful with this technique, looking in context outside of debt. Say something like weight loss, which would have similar motivational issues. I think field experiments could be useful to calibrate this model. But something I've thought of recently that I think is very useful as we think about the value of a paper like this is this kind of entrepreneurial example that I mentioned at the end. We know this debt snowball is going to be costly in terms of payments people make on interest. I think for most people with loans, we're going to be talking about thousands of dollars to pay for this kind of strategy to execute this extra motivational benefit. And so I wonder, kind of as a thought experiment, that this is a very big inefficiency. Perhaps a debt consolidation company that was maybe benevolent or wanted to reduce the defaults they had might actually try some kind of visualization for free with their customers and put things in ascending order rather than having their customers think about having one large debt to pay off. Or alternatively, perhaps the debt consolidation service might offer this service for, say, a few $100s and find that customers would actually sign up with them, pay a $100 or visualization premium, and then actually become more successful at paying off debts. One of the neat things when you actually look at the why behind this is you can have these kind of ideas, not just that the debt snowball is effective, but there might be ways to get the same motivational gains at a lower cost to consumers. Thank you.
Okay, so if you thought John's task discussing 3 papers was hard, we now have Dustin discussing 4 papers in 10 minutes. So please welcome Dustin Beckett, who's an economist in our Office of Research.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First, I want to thank our panel. I'm grateful for you all to be here today, share your work with us, and it's been a pleasure interacting with you all so far. As Melissa said, my name is Dustin Beckett. I'm an economist at the CFPB. My work is mainly in the orbit of financial disclosure and consumer testing, so those are the lenses through which I'll be discussing these papers. I'm actually going to try and adopt a different strategy than John Lanning did, although I think he did an amazing job. I just don't think I can speak that quickly. So I will provide comments and I will suggest ways forward, just not quite so systematically. I'm also going to give some possible ideas for policy, particularly as they apply to information provision, so disclosure, financial education, consumer tools. So it's a good time to re-point out the disclaimer that whatever I say here is definitely not the opinion of the CFPB and or anyone else. Except, well, I think I stand by that. Okay. So first we had Learning Millennial Style, and I want to say that I think it's a shame we weren't able to get Professor Carlin's video up for you guys because it is a very entertaining video, albeit somewhat irreverent. But if you get a chance to see it, I suggest that you do. I think there are a number of important things to note about this paper. First, that the authors appear to identify a trade-off between shareability and effectiveness. So in particular, their video that was most shareable was also least effective. I actually hope that this result is not true. This is because I'm an employee of the federal government, and we have a long history of producing work that is neither shareable nor effective. Hopefully we can do better in both dimensions at once. I do think that this general point is very important, though, and that is that when we as policymakers consider information provision, be it disclosure or consumer tools or financial education, that the measured impact is not just the impact on the first audience, it's also the impact on the people with whom those people share the video and with whom those people share the video and so on. Along those lines, one way in which I think I could see this line of research moving is to actually expand the scope of total impact. So in particular, I think impact begins when the consumer decides how to allocate their precious attention. I don't know, do I watch the video? Which video do I watch? So I think it'd be interesting to design a test, if not a field study, but which allows people to allocate their attention elsewhere. And then look to see of the people exposed to the video, how many actually watched it, and then was it effective? How broad was its reach? And I was encouraged to see that Professor Carlin noted that they will be doing a field study, so I think that's great. Next, we heard about simulated experience and investment endurance. In this paper, the author tackles the particular aspect of the larger question of how do we or how ought one to communicate risk. And I think we see some very promising results. In particular, participants who were exposed to the simulation as opposed to the description were better able to estimate probabilities surrounding the risky asset. So things like, what's the probability of experiencing loss? From a policymaker's perspective, of course, I wonder, should we be using these kind of simulations? Of course, that brought me back one step, and I think actually the broader question is not how do we necessarily communicate risk, but how do we help consumers to choose the right financial products for their situation? And so we have certain financial products that are extraordinarily complex. Can we use simulation to help people learn about those complex financial products and to choose the right product for them? Similarly, we have certain financial products that are used in many different ways by different consumers, and I wonder, can we use simulation to demonstrate the costs and benefits of products given a certain usage pattern for a certain product? I think these are very exciting possibilities, if perhaps a little afield from the paper here. But one thing I think would be nice to see in this paper in the future, or for future work, is to give us some additional objective criteria, particularly in the action space. So we see clear improvements in people's ability, like I said, people's abilities to estimate probabilities around a risky asset, but then in the action space, we see people allocating more when they see the simulation to the risky asset. Now, given the setup, this is probably indicative of better decision making, but not necessarily. So, of course, I don't have any good ideas about how to do that, so I'll leave that up to you. Next, we heard about stock ownership and learning from financial information. Here, the authors investigate the question, are people's ability to correctly form beliefs affected by their previous choices? And this is different than how we typically think about confirmation bias, which is generally considered to be whether or not people's ability to correctly form beliefs is affected by their previously held beliefs. And they find that on average, people update more in the correct direction when they get information that conforms in some sense with their previous actions. I had a chance to exchange a few emails with Professor Kunin prior to the conference, so I thought some of the things that she said in those emails were illuminating, so I thought I'd state a couple of them here. One is that the people who update more also update better. So these are the people who hold stocks in response to good news and hold bonds in response to bad news. We heard that they update more, and I think it's just important to say that they also update better. So their posterior estimates are closer to the objective Bayesian posterior. And I think that's important for the obvious reason that it tells us, who's doing better and who's doing worse, and could point the way to future interventions. The second, which actually she mentioned, was that the results are on differential beliefs are updated within person. So how much does one person update when she holds a stock compared to how much does that same person update when she holds a bond, presumably averaged over all participants. I think that's important because it provides evidence that the results are not necessarily, or are not driven by selection bias, which perhaps maybe you would have thought that they were. One thing that, personal anecdote, that I thought of while you were presenting, which is I participated in a couple of fMRI studies as a graduate student because they pay a great wage. And I vowed to never do them again because I have such a large head that they had to remove the pillow for me, and it was kind of torturous. So I wonder, what are the selection effects of excluding people with enormous heads? I don't know. So what's the right response to this evidence? At the very least, I think we can say that one-size-fits-all information provision is probably not appropriate. Adding to that, the direct interpretation, I think, would seem to be that the effect of a given information provision will differ between two consumers depending on what their past experiences were. And perhaps we could say if one wants to achieve a given desired effect, then the information provision ought to be tailored to that consumer's experience, although I think we need to do additional work to show that. Finally, we had heard about small victories. The authors demonstrated support for both the goal gradient theory and social cognitive theory, although they were referred to differently in the presentation as pre-subgoal motivation and post-subgoal motivation, right? Yeah, the interesting result here is that there were evidence for both things, but the second phenomenon was more powerful in this setting as people who had their task grouped in ascending manner completed their work most quickly. And I wanted to give another anecdote here, which was that I, like many people at the CFPB, in preparation for this conference, had to read an enormous number of papers. And when I got mine, the first thing I did was sort them in order from shortest to longest. And yeah, well, at the time I thought I knew that I was being willfully irrational, because of course it took time to actually sort the papers. But now we have evidence that not only was I being irrational, but maybe I was being smart. So any paper that can make me look smart is okay by me. Okay. 2 minutes, wow, I'm doing great. Okay, so one thing that ties each of these papers together is that they provide us clues about how policymakers ought to present information, or might present information to consumers. Each of these papers show that effective information transmission is not just about information per se. Framing matters, form matters, presentation matters. And to say that presentation matters is probably obvious to most of the academics in the room. Well, I'll say some of the academics in the room. I'm sure it's obvious to all non-academics in the room. But this is typically not the starting place when we're talking about financial disclosure, where like quote-unquote full disclosure is considered the best thing for everyone, including consumers, and leads to things like the dreaded static wall of text. So I think there's a lot of work that remains. I'm hopeful that papers like these papers and papers like these can lead us towards something new and better in the future. Thank you.
That concludes our panel. I'm not sure if Chris is coming up to say something else or no. I think we're just done for the day. No? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm leaving. You guys can talk about things. Okay, sorry. So you guys, yes, you guys have the ability to respond to some of Dustin's comments. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, I'll just be brief. Dustin, I really like the way you present, and you're a really deep thinker, and that's really great. This allocation of attention, I think, is important, and one of the things we're looking into is, if you were to put the different videos on the side, how do people choose what to watch? That's important, and also, like, we are just looking at if you watch the video, do you want to share it? But now, let's suppose you're further down the chain and you know that you've received it from your parent or a friend or a colleague or from the CFPB. How does that change your sharing and so forth? So those types of interactions are things that we're looking into, and so that was a really good suggestion.
Okay, thanks a lot. I wonder how you did like reading all the 4 papers and making these great comments. Normally, I think I can speak for my colleagues. Normally, we take the the flight to the conference to read the papers that we will discuss. So this was clearly impossible. You raised a very interesting point. Who am I actually talking to generally for the paper? I would like to take the analogy to car driving. How do we get to know how fast we should drive on the motorway? I mean, let's go to Germany because there we can drive as fast as we want to. So there's no speed limits. So how do we figure out how fast to drive? We just do it by not like opening a book and reading about how difficult it is to drive fast. We just go into the car and drive. So we learn by experience generally. So my general claim here is that banks should, or financial institutions should learn how to communicate risks in a way that is comprehensible and that is easy to understand. And this is, I think, not conducted to the level it should be. Then it comes back to the question: should the regulator or the industry take care of this? There's different opinions on this, and my opinion is that it's difficult for the regulator to say, okay, we should force everybody, like doing the road test for car drivers, we should require our investors to do like an investment test or so. I don't think that's the right way to go. I think it's the industry's effort here are required to improve the risk communication to investors. Thank you.
So thank you so much for the great comments, Dustin. I just want to make 2 points. There was a question about whether the sample that I'm using may be representative. I mean, these might be brave people who do not mind being in a brain scanner and whose heads are of a maximum size. So we tried hard to get normal people, like I said. These are all individuals from Bonn who have jobs and families and are healthy. They're screened out to be if they're not healthy. But if you don't buy that sample, the same results actually I replicated in the U.S. sample of college students, so not adults with real financial decisions to make on their own. But I think that across these 2 countries you see replication. So I think the result is there. I also wanted to. You brought up this really good point that the information provision might need to differ across. In the population, depending on people's experience. And just to give you one more bit of evidence that this is probably very important and what we must do, I have some work that I'm doing with Stefan Nagel from University of Michigan, and we're just using a large survey that's the Michigan Consumer Survey, and they have thousands of households across the U.S. for many, many years. And you can ask these households about their belief that the stock market will yield more than 0% return over the next year. And it turns out that the households that have the most pessimistic assessment of this probability, that the stock market will return more will return a positive return over the next year, the people who are most pessimistic are those from low income, low education, low SES situations. So in the population in this country, there's huge disparity in the assessment that people have in their minds about the chance that if they put $1,000 in the stock market today, they'll get more than 1,000 a year from now. And so we need to direct the message about what equities can pay. We need to change that message to correct for these differences in beliefs at the household level.
All right, Dustin, thank you for your comments. There weren't so many for mine, but the first thing I wanted to mention was I had changed the names on the psychological theories from social cognitive to post-sub-goal motivation and goal gradient to pre-sub-goal motivation. That was kind of a strategic decision on my part. I still think those types of motivations are in essence tied to those psychological theories, but it's something I didn't want to necessarily want to argue with people about, and it's something I didn't need to argue about in the paper. So we take a much looser interpretation on that, but I would say they're inspired, or at least in essence, those theories. The other thing I'd say is I'm glad to know that my methods are helping you read all these papers as discussant, but I think that's also a good point that these techniques of small victories and this ascending order could be useful in a lot of types of tasks. and not just debt. And I think with this paper, we've actually gotten kind of a broader motivational theory now using this type of technique.
Okay, so we do have, were you done? I'm sorry. Okay, some minutes for questions from the audience. Eric up front. I think there's a microphone coming.
First off, this was a tremendous panel. It was, lots of tools that aren't normally in the handbook of disclosure, and so I think it's just fantastic. They also have in common this notion of learning over time. I sort of want to ask Stefan for a contrast and think about this a little bit. One would be tempted to say that, oh, if people experience things, they don't need disclosure, right? That I have experience from the stock market, I could learn. And, sort of your analogy to the Autobahn. I mean, I don't think Audi gets more money when you go faster, or certainly if you crash, that's not their concern. But the concern I have is I'm thinking of like the Gnesian Potter study, where you basically state, very much like yours, I will play this if I play 20 of them, I do it in advance. But if I play them sequentially, people stop playing. So that's almost the reverse result. And it suggests to me there's something really important I just want to emphasize or ask you. This is simulated experience. I'm not getting outcomes. Right? When your simulated experience, I basically get an outcome, but I'm not playing. I'm not getting the emotional impact of each. I think part of it is the psychology of this kind of disclosure is going to be sensitive to the timing and sort of whether I actually see the outcomes or not. I'm just curious your response to that.
Yeah, I don't know whether I got the question correctly. So, I mean, the main purpose of this study was actually to test to what extent people will become, again, myopic. So we basically nudged them to be non-myopic in two different ways. And let's frame the results differently. After 7 periods in our experiment, they were investing about the same. So it seems to be that this effect is not as persistent as we maybe hoped it to be. But again, like it comes back to the question, what is the right speed we should take on a German Autobahn without any speed limits? So it's tricky to say. I'm coming also back to your last point. I mean, what's the objective right decision? I don't know. I think we are social scientists. I mean, it's not like we test it once and then we have the final result. So I encourage everybody to dig into this further and try to come up with measures. What is the actual right decision? Also, given your concern about this, that we become myopic on the way to the final end. Yeah, that's all I can do with that. Sorry.
Do we have any other questions? Sure, right there.
So Alice, one of the things is the task definition is largely endogenous. I mean, you can give me a big task. I can either describe it as big, or I'd like to get down to $3,000. That would be an achievement, or 2,500. So I have the ability to take what you'd call a big debt and break it into small subtasks, but so does somebody else. I mean, it's a very interesting idea that somebody else could do that for you. Break it into a subtask, say, here's the high interest small bit, get you to pay that first, and then you say, boy, I just had a win. I mean, it's a very interesting concept. I don't know what you think about endogenous versus exogenous categories.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think a lot about this, although I don't know if I have any definitive conclusions. With many things with motivation, it seems like people could achieve superior performance if they could just be able to force themselves to believe certain types of things. And as economists, I think it's often like, why can't you control your beliefs if it would be optimal to have these type of beliefs. But speaking more specific about this issue, that's one of the reasons I think in my final mention I said maybe a debt consolidation firm could be involved, because it may be necessary for a third party to really divide these things up, kind of like what I did in my experiment, and I defined what the kind of task was going to be and what the sub-goals were going to be, and kind of like in the original debt snowball method, that maybe if people have to define it for themselves, they aren't able to see these things as separate events. So maybe if you're trying to lose, say, 20 pounds, and you make the distinction that losing 7.5 pounds is your first goal, maybe that doesn't have the same motivational effect because you were the one to determine it. So I think third parties might be the best answer I can think of on the top of my head.
So I had one thought, sort of combining Dustin's comments with two of the papers, a convex combination maybe of all of those, which is that one possibility that these in conjunction raise is that an effective form of disclosure, more effective than what has been done in the past, might be a form that discloses to a person what their own past actions have been and what the result of those has been, or to take it one step further, to disclose to them what the result of those actions is every time a result occurs. So you don't just see, that you incurred a fee on your bank account, but you see that the distribution of the fees that you have received, and that is related to the particular choices that you made at some point in the past. That might help people understand better the things that they are in principle supposed to understand from the disclosure, but in practice, when it's out of context and when it's not related to their own past decisions, and therefore they don't update. Maybe they will update when the actual experience. So I guess this is, two or three of the papers together. Their actual experience isn't so much a simulation, but it's a real experience with the context of their own ego being invested in it, and with feedback on a regular basis. So now that we've solved the problem of disclosure, do we have any other questions from the audience?
I wanted to say first that this was an amazing session. Just 100 times more of this kind of research will really put the CFPB ahead in its mission. So I just want to encourage more people to do this kind of thing. I think that the simulation as a method of disclosure is very interesting, even if you don't do the probabilities the same, just to illustrate the provisions of a contract by, taking people through a simulation and having them experience it could be a much more salient way of just understanding the contract and seeing what happens. It is difficult to do the simulations without having other effects. So the question I have there is just whether this particular simulation is getting another effect. If you have loss aversion, then risks are going to look more attractive if you've packaged together a bunch of small risks into a bunch. And it might be that inevitably showing them this simulation puts them in this frame of saying, what if I got a bunch of those risks? What would that be like? Even though you tell them at the end of the day they're only going to have one of them, one of the outcomes, it's hard for them to not be put into that frame.
Maybe
Okay, I think,
Yeah, maybe I'll just quickly respond. Thanks for the comments. So we are working on that. So we are trying to get a better understanding whether showing investors intermediate result, will it make better or worse in terms of how myopic they are. And there's actually some mixed evidence. If we look at the literature on myopic loss aversion, it seems to be very subtle. I mean, David can talk an hour about this. That the results are not as robust as maybe previously thought. And it seems to be, there's some evidence that showing some intermediate results will even decrease myopia, because it makes more salient that there is gains and losses that cancel each other out. I think so. Again, I would encourage everybody to do research on this, because I've been doing research on myopic loss aversion for 10 years now. Lots of data, even on the graveyard, and I'm still not sure about all of the effects going on here.
So I just wanted to add to that comment. I think one of the things that the CFPB could accomplish, there's so much data online now, and so individuals can be tracked, and they are being tracked by firms to where they visit and what they're doing and so forth. And so you can imagine a situation in which the an individual is, tracked with their own decision making, their own spending. They volunteer for this, and so they do this, and then you put this together in sort of some sort of recommendation of what they should do, or you gauge their preferences, and so there can be disclosure that's very individualized based on people's. And I know that sounds like it's very cumbersome, but with a lot of the techniques that people are studying big data, you can study individuals in this way as well for them, for their purposes. And I think that, some of these things could be applied. It's usually hard to get, people to do this because they don't trust that their information is not going to be used for something. Or if you use a company, could there be ethical considerations where you're gaining access to privacy and so forth? But, an organization like the CFPB that is dedicated to protecting people, maybe could facilitate some of this.
Thank you very much. On that note, let me close for the day. Just reminding everyone we will start again tomorrow at 9 in the morning, and to bring your badge because that is needed to get back in through the security. And of course, you want to make sure you make it to the next exciting day. One other thing, I need to briefly talk logistics with the panelists, all of the panelists, not just today's, and scientific committee members and ARC members, just briefly up here in the front. So if you people could come this way, that would be useful.